Hey, thank you very much, everyone. Good morning to you all. And my presentation is on HMAS Australia 1, the indefatigable class battlecruiser that was the flagship, the first flagship of the Royal Australian Navy during World War I. And the premise for this, or partly the premise for this talk, is that Australia 1, in my estimation, has become a forgotten flagship. Okay, we all remember many famous ships from World War I and World War II, especially, but Australia 1 seems to have slipped away from the consciousness. And that's very strange because once upon a time, it was the biggest thing to happen to Australia. And we'll see about that in a minute. Okay, so here's some of the books that I used for information. It's an excellent book. Very specialized on battle cruisers. This was very good for general information on battleships and battle cruisers, and has a separate section on HMAS Australia because it was slightly modified from the indefatigable class. And here we have the overview of what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so as I said, we're going to look at the premise that Australia 1 became the forgotten flagship. We'll also look at the actual genesis of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers and how Jackie Fisher had a lot to do with that, obviously. Then we'll look at the ship itself. We'll look at the specifications, the armament, etc., and what made HMAS Australia the most powerful warship in the Southern Hemisphere up to World War I. We'll look at the early years, or the early part of the war, I should say, where HMAS Australia was used to hunt the German Pacific Squadron of von Spee. Then we'll see how HMAS Australia joined the Grand Fleet from 1915 up to around the Battle of Jutland. And of course, how HMAS Australia, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, missed the Battle of Jutland. And then we'll see from 1916 to 1918, the kind of routine of the ships of the Grand Fleet, especially HMAS Australia, in the North Sea, patrolling and looking at life aboard the ship. And then we're going to look at a rather controversial area. After the war, of course, they had the peace, and then mutiny, which was something that is not quite known. And of course, then the end of HMAS Australia. Okay, so when HMAS Australia arrived in 1913, it was, and I used the analogy yesterday when I talked to another group, almost the same as when Queen Elizabeth II arrived in Australia in 1954. Children were given the day off school. The story was in all the newspapers. There were many special functions, official and unofficial, to celebrate HMAS Australia and the other ships of the Royal Australian Navy Fleet Unit, as it was called. This was the birth of the Royal Australian Navy as far as the actual ships were concerned. So it wasn't just HMAS Australia, but other cruisers such as Sydney and Encounter and some destroyers were able to arrive in Sydney Harbour for the celebrations. This was, as I said, at the time, one of the biggest things to happen to Australia. So it's somewhat of a surprise, and it was a surprise to a lot of people, that only 11 years later, HMAS Australia was sent to the bottom as one of the stipulations of the Washington Naval Conference. A lot of people didn't understand that. Why should we lose our flagship? But of course, this was British policy when they had to adhere to the Washington Naval Conference conditions, and HMAS Australia was sent to the bottom and scuttled off Sydney Heads. So how did it go from this wonderful beginning to this sorrowful end? Okay, So we've established that HMAS Australia was definitely a symbol of national pride, okay, along with many other great national treasures, but somehow it's been erased from the consciousness of Australians, or most Australians. It was, after all, the first flagship of the Royal Australian Navy. And yet, and I did this yesterday, there were quite a few elderly people in the group that I talked to. I said, does anyone remember HMAS Australia? And of course, they wouldn't have been born at that time, but certainly they may have heard of it from their mothers and fathers. They said, oh yes, HMAS Australia, that was that ship in World War II, wasn't it? And I said, no, that was HMAS Australia number 2. I'm talking about number 1. Nobody knew anything about it. Perhaps one of the reasons is that it was an unlucky ship, and we'll see why that is so. And also, unfortunately, an unhappy ship. And that probably stems from the fact that, well, a number of reasons. First of all, the lack of luck in war, and secondly, perceived slights and unequal treatment by the ship's crew. So we're going to find out how it came to this. But before we do that, we need to digress and see where the Dreadnought battleships and battlecruisers came from. So I'm sure you're familiar with this person, Admiral Sir John Fisher, or Jackie Fisher as he was better known. A very brilliant man, but a very erratic man. As you probably know, he was first Sea Lord in the early years of the 20th century and made a lot of amazing changes that brought the Royal Navy into the modern era. But at the same time, he was a man who definitely wanted his way and was always threatening to resign, and indeed did resign, much to the displeasure and also pleasure of a lot of people. He was eccentric. Okay, one of the anecdotes or one of the stories of Jackie Fisher is that he loved to dance. And when he was the admiral in charge of the Mediterranean fleet, he held regular dances. Now, obviously, there are no women aboard the ships in the late 19th century. So he would get his flag captain and other officers in the wardroom to dance with, and he would actually order everybody to start dancing to the latest waltz. So that was seen as some sort of eccentric behavior. Also, of course, he loved to write very long and very erratic letters to people. Suddenly he would, be writing a sentence and then put block letters about 2 inches high to accentuate a point. He would write other notes in the margin with many arrows and daggers. And this was even when he wrote official letters in his capacity as First Sea Lord. So this was also seen as kind of strange behavior. Now, as First Sea Lord, around this time, 1904, 1905, there was an incident that happened when the Russian fleet, the Russian Baltic fleet, was sailing to the other side of the world to challenge the Japanese, and they sunk quite a few British fishing boats in the Dogger Bank. And this was, the Russians thought somehow, of course, there must be Japanese torpedo boats in the North Sea. They must have sailed all the way across the world to attack us. And this was seen in a very dim light, obviously, by the British. And the British sent their Channel Fleet, which was commanded by Lord Charles Beresford. And this fellow would become the bête noire for Jackie Fisher. Anyway, Beresford was very well connected. He was part of the nobility. And when he met the Russian fleet, he ordered his fleet to be divided into 2 parts. And one part of his fleet was to sail away. not too far away. And if it came to action, he was going to challenge the Russians on equal terms. Okay, so it came to nothing, thank God. But Fisher's idea, or Fisher's anger at this stupid idea, knew no bounds. When he found out that Beresford had divided his fleet into half, he was apoplectic. He said, if there is a war, there's no such thing as mercy or chivalry to the enemy. You destroy the enemy, sir. To which Beresford replied, however, sir, the Royal Navy is built on chivalry. And of course, you can imagine this stupidity as far as Jackie Fisher was concerned. He said, Beresford said, it would be unfair and un-British to actually challenge the Russians if it came to war on an unequal footing. Okay, so that was Beresford's idea. So Beresford and Fisher would have a long rivalry and enmity towards each other. And of course, there were other people that Fisher did not like. They divided into two camps. So anyway, I'm probably going too much about that. I'll move on. Okay, so as First Sea Lord, he made massive changes. Okay, so some people said, he's the man, we're going to follow him. And others said, no, he's the Antichrist, we've got to get rid of him. Okay, so what are these changes? All right, first of all, he scrapped 140 obsolete Royal Navy ships. Okay, very controversial. But most of these ships were absolute rubbish. And some of them were even 50 and 60 years old. So probably a very good move. Okay, he introduced the destroyer, okay, as a class of ship. Before that, there were, of course, torpedo boats, and they were getting larger by the 1900s, but he envisaged a class of ship that would be able to destroy, obviously, the name, these torpedo boats, and of course, this is where we get destroyers from. Also, submarine warfare. And this is another thing that Beresford hated Fisher for. As far as he was concerned, submarines were unmanly and un-British and an unfair way of fighting. And how dare you make this new weapon that could challenge our supremacy at sea? To which Fisher replied, and do you think the Germans will have those considerations? Okay, another innovation was the use of turbine engines. Okay, Fisher championed this, and that's one of the reasons to get rid of the old ships as much as possible, and to phase out coal and to bring in oil firing. And he wanted to improve the standard of Royal Navy gunnery. He championed also the use of torpedoes. Okay, so he brought about what we call the Dreadnought Revolution. Fear God and Dreadnought. An all big gun battleship with twice the number of main guns. Steam turbine propulsion for reliability and high speed. Improved armor and the latest technology, including the use of electricity instead of gaslight, for instance. And the Dreadnought would be built, the first one, in 12 months from laying down to commissioning. Well, that's what he wanted. And that this ship would be able to defeat any other two current battleships in existence. So here we see a picture of a pre-Dreadnought, okay, from the Majestic class, often cited as the progenitor of pre-Dreadnought battleships. And then you see the size of this plan view, and now we look at HMS Dreadnought as a comparison. And you can see, in many ways, there is no comparison. So the Royal Navy was going from this to that. And Fisher, by basically robbing other ships of their guns, the Lord Nelson class, and by furious activity, was able to get the ship launched and almost underway in that 12 months. And there's a beautiful picture of HMS Dreadnought at sea. Now, Dreadnought was one thing, but Fisher had another idea. Okay, armored cruisers, merchant raiders, things like that. It's not necessary to send a Dreadnought when you can send an armored cruiser against these things. However, how about you have an armored cruiser that is like a Dreadnought? It's twice the size. It's something, as he said, he actually called it HMS Armadillo, because it would be like an armadillo lapping up ants. And so we get the Battlecruiser concept, which of course HMAS Australia was a Battlecruiser. And they were nicknamed the Splendid Cats because one of the two of the later class Battlecruisers, HMAS Lion and Tiger, of course, bore the name of strong feline hunters, and the press got onto this. So these ships would have enough big guns to sink any 2 or even 3 armored cruisers. And it's interesting to note that when the German battlecruiser, Goeben, was in the Mediterranean, a British admiral, Arbuthnot, had, I think it was maybe 4 armored cruisers with him, and he refused to bring Goeben to action, although he could have done it, because he thought he would have absolutely no chance. So in some ways, perhaps this was a justified concept. But of course, we did see later on in World War II how the British brought the pocket battleship Graf Spee to action with 2 light cruisers and a heavy cruiser, and did succeed in, while not crippling it, but in driving it into harbour. Anyway, that's another story. So battle cruisers would have to have very high speed to evade any ships more powerful. In other words, battleships. So battleships carried more guns, they had heavier armour, but they would not be able to catch up with a battle cruiser to sink them. And Fisher was all about speed. They would have lighter armour. You have to make a sacrifice somewhere to get that increase in speed. And he sacrificed armour protection, and he had the dictum that speed is armour. Now, of course, we know with hindsight that that is not correct, and that certainly when battle cruisers were used in the battle line of Jutland, they suffered, especially the British battle cruisers, they suffered very much. Okay, another concept or another idea for the use of battle cruisers was to hunt down enemy raiders and cruisers and to use them as a kind of global rapid response. And when Invincible and Inflexible went after Admiral Spee at the Falkland Islands, this came to fruition. And a secondary role, although it became the major role, was to scout for the battle fleets. So in other words, they would be fast units able to range ahead of the main battle fleet, find out where the enemy was, and report that to the main fleet, and also to destroy the enemy scouting units. And here we have a very nice views of HMAS Australia. As I said before, an Indefatigable class battlecruiser that was modified. So we're now going to look actually at the ship itself that we ended up getting. Now there is, again, some controversy because at the time it was built, the British were already building the next generation of battlecruisers, such as HMS Lion and HMS Prince Mary. So why were we buying the last generation? Okay, so a lot of people say that we spent a lot of money back in those days on something that was almost obsolete. Well, the fact is it was cheaper, and we were a country perhaps that couldn't quite afford having the best and latest. And if you consider HMS New Zealand, which gave sterling service all the way through World War I, maybe it wasn't such a bad investment after all. Anyway, we'll look now at some of the specifications of the ship. Okay, so the ship was laid down in 1910. John Brown Shipyard, a very famous yard, of course, where many famous ships such as HMS Hood were built. modified indefatigable class. And I'll tell you what, indefatigable, it's a hard one to pronounce. Anyway, so it was launched as HMAS Australia, a displacement of 22,400 tons, 590 feet long, 80 feet wide, and a speed of 25 knots. That was the design speed. It was, of course, the flagship of the Royal Australian Navy Fleet Unit. And at the time, and up until the first 2 years of World War I, the most powerful warship in the Southern Hemisphere. Because, of course, a little bit later after that, Argentina got the Rivadavia and Marino, which were quite powerful units. Okay, the main armament for the ship, 8 12-inch 45 caliber Mark 10 Star guns. Now, these were the same guns that were on Dreadnought and the first generation of Dreadnoughts and Battlecruisers, such as the Invincible class. They were very reliable. They were very accurate. They didn't have as high a muzzle velocity as the 50 caliber guns that came a bit later, but they had a better barrel life and were certainly seen to be much easier to maintain than the later mark of 12-inch guns. A range of 19,000 yards, a shell weight of 850 pounds, and a muzzle velocity of 2,725 feet per second. And you see there the metric equivalents if you want to see that. They were mounted in 4 twin turrets, and this shows you the crew of a turret. That's their nice sort of classroom photo, shall we say. And the 41 men to operate each turret, and of course that means also the barbette and shell room underneath, was rather small compared to some of the later battleships and battlecruisers with bigger guns. And as I said to the people yesterday, you would feel perhaps very safe at first being behind some of the thickest armor on the ship, but then you remember that below you are hundreds of shells and high explosive charges, and if they go up, you will go up and the whole ship will go up. And unfortunately for the British, this is of course what happened at Jutland on 3 occasions. Okay, above you see the actual layout of the turrets. This reflects the second generation of dreadnoughts, such as the Neptune and Colossus class, in having amidship turrets that were en echelon, as the French would say. This was to give, supposedly, the ability to fire a full broadside across the deck. But if you were to train this turret on the port side to starboard and fire across the deck, you probably would rip up half the boards on the deck, and certainly you would damage a lot of the superstructure, and continued firing would start to cause some pretty heavy damage. So it wasn't until later that they realized that having turrets, as they call them, P and Q turrets, such as this, would be a lot better to have them on the center line. To the left, we see a photograph that I took at the Australian War Museum. And it's, again, I have to say, one of the reasons why I have this premise of the forgotten flagship is that the sole part of the museum is one cabinet dedicated to HMAS Australia 1, just one cabinet. It has a beautiful model in there, of course, that you can't see in this photo, and the a few of the accoutrements and medals, etc. A painting of Patey, I think it is, the ship's bell, etc., etc. But you see here the size of the actual projectile for one of the 12-inch guns, an armor-piercing projectile, and a rating sitting precariously on top of the muzzle there. And of course, as I say, you know, these guys had to be able to scramble out and clean the guns and make sure the tampions were put back on the guns afterwards, etc. So if you slipped, it was a fair distance down to the deck. Hopefully nobody did that, unless they had a bit of rum maybe. Okay, here's a detail of that beautiful model that's at the Australian War Museum to show the secondary armament. Now, when Fisher originally put together the idea for Dreadnought and the Battlecruisers, he hated the idea of having any secondary armament whatsoever. He wanted just 12-inch guns, nothing else. He was reluctant to allow the original HMS Dreadnought to have 12-pounder anti-torpedo boat guns. And many of them were mounted on top of turrets, which were useless anyway. And in fact, the 12-pounder was pretty useless all round. So eventually some sort of sanity reigned, and they started to put 4-inch guns. I mean, the idea of trying to blow up torpedo boats with 12-inch guns at close distance is like absolutely ridiculous. So the 4-inch guns were put in. They were mounted mostly in these open casemates at the sides of the superstructure, and also superstructure towards the rear. And they had a range of 9,600 yards, shell weight 31 pounds, and a muzzle velocity of 2,300 feet per second. And you see here also a very good photo here, this part of the model, which shows the conning tower. Now, the conning tower was the heaviest armored part of the ship, but it's amazing that in the Royal Navy, at least, I can't think of anyone in World War I or even perhaps in World War II that ever went into the conning tower during a battle to actually maneuver and fight the ship, which is supposedly what it was there for, but everybody did it from the bridge. I guess perhaps that's part of the Nelson touch. And we see here some of the other smaller weapons aboard the ship. Okay, a 3-pounder Hotchkiss saluting gun, which was used pretty much in these days for ceremonial purposes, although originally it had been plastered all over many old battleships in what they called fighting tops, which were the towers that used to be above the bridges, etc. Very much like a fighting top on a ship of the line. And to the right, which was a sign of the times, of course, a 4-inch quickfire based on the secondary guns, or very similar, which was a high-angle gun to shoot down aircraft. And as I say there, you would have not much chance, really, of shooting down an aircraft, which even in World War I could fly at about 110 to 120 miles an hour with a gun like this, but you might have a chance to shoot down a Zeppelin. Okay, one of the other idiosyncrasies of capital ships during World War I and even into the 1920s and 30s was arming them with torpedoes. I think in the whole history of modern warfare, battleships and battlecruisers, if you take them all together, there were only 2 occasions on which they actually fired a torpedo in anger. And in both circumstances, as far as I know, they missed. And obviously, a battleship or a battlecruiser is all about its guns. And certainly in World War II, surviving ships of World War I era and interwar era had their torpedo tubes removed. And to the right, again, a sign of the times, towards the end of the war, HMAS Australia was one of the first ships in the Royal Navy, and the Royal Australian Navy, of course, to actually have flying off platforms for Sopwith pups, and then later Sopwith camels, and even a 1.5 strutter, which was a 2-seat observation plane. So this, again, was a sign of the times. Okay, we look here at the armour distribution for HMAS Australia. And it's a battle cruiser, and the first generation, of which the Invincible and Indefatigable classes were, had armour that was comparable, shall we say, to the old armoured cruisers. So that means pretty much 6-inch belt armor, although the main armor in some books and references for HMAS Australia is quoted as 7-inch, but as far as I'm concerned, and other sources, it was probably 6 inches. Let's put it this way: it's not going to make much difference if a German 12-inch high-velocity shell penetrates. Okay, and the turrets, and funnily enough here, the conning tower is not shown. They had the heavier armor. But the biggest problem for the first generation, and indeed the second generation of battlecruisers as well, was the deck armor. Okay, so 2 inches of deck armor is not going to hold out even a German 8-inch shell from an armored cruiser. Okay, it's going to penetrate. And if it penetrates into your barbette and your shell room, or magazine as it was called also, then you're going to have a catastrophic explosion. So deck armor after Jutland was augmented, but only around the actual turrets. So this was the great problem. And of course, the beautiful HMS Hood in its fight with Bismarck in World War II was most probably sunk by shells penetrating the deck armor. So always a problem as engagements became much longer distance. Okay, you have plunging shell fire, and that means your deck armor needs to keep the shells out or even deflect if hopeful, but not to be. Okay, the machinery that drove HMAS Australia was quite powerful for its time. Okay, 44,000 shaft horsepower, driving direct drive, being driven by direct drive turbines. On trials, the ship actually produced 50,000 shaft horsepower and was able to reach 26 knots. Okay, now if you go to the Australian War Museum and you walk around a lot, you will actually find one of the propeller screws of HMAS Australia. But you better look for it because it's not easy to see, and it's sort of tucked in a quiet area behind the museum there. And that's a photograph on the left of my partner Therese to show you a comparison in size. And to the right, of course, unfortunately for the stokers, HMAS Australia was coal-fired, not oil-fired, and that meant a lot of dirty, back-breaking work, shoveling the coal into the boilers, and of course, when you're out of coal, a hell of a lot of work coaling the ship, which all sailors hated with a passion. So HMAS Australia was the flagship of what was known as the Royal Australian Navy Fleet Unit. So where did this idea come from? What was it about? Well, the so-called colonial Australian navies before Federation were obviously obsolete. There had been representatives from the British government and defence establishment that had come to Australia on fact-finding missions. And an Empire Defence Conference was held, and part of this planning resulted in the Royal Australian Navy being formed in 1901. Okay, obviously we did not have enough local talent that was experienced and trained to be the officers. So the majority of the officers and the men to begin with came from the Royal Navy, or they were ex-Royal Navy who had emigrated to live in Australia. Okay, Britain desired the Dominions, that's us, Australia and Canada and New Zealand and South Africa at that time, to order ships for fleet units. So this was the idea that each Dominion would have a fleet unit. Okay, so Australia was the only Dominion that actually paid for and formed a fleet unit. New Zealand actually bought a ship that was pretty much identical to HMAS Australia that would become HMS New Zealand, but it was pretty much crewed by Royal Navy personnel. There were some Kiwis aboard, But we'll come to that later, because that's another story in itself that impinges on the story of HMAS Australia. And of course, as we know from the earlier slides, HMAS Australia led the fleet into Sydney Harbour, the fleet unit, on October 1913. And not long after that, of course, World War I began. But here is what happened. Okay, anyone who's sharp-eyed will see a big error that has to do with HMAS Australia in this video. Okay, so that little clip, as I said, there is some inaccuracy in that clip. So if you're sharp-eyed, and as one person has already been, you might see something to do with HMAS Australia that's not quite correct, and you can tell me about it later on when we have the question time. But anyway, let's move on. So who would be the commander for the Australian Fleet Unit? That man would be Vice Admiral Sir George Patey. And he was very reluctant to do the job in the first place. Okay, so he was the son of a Royal Navy captain, as many of these guys were. He saw action as a midshipman in HMS Shah in the 1870s, promoted to captain in 1900, assistant director of naval intelligence, so he's definitely a man on the move, and promoted to rear admiral in 1909 and commander of the 2nd Battle Squadron of the, as it was in those days, the Channel Fleet. So he was a man who was definitely on the way up, and he probably saw for himself, a bright future, which did not include sailing to the other side of the world and taking charge of an Australian fleet. And certainly he was very reluctant to do so. So he had to be persuaded to take up the position. Okay, so by this time, the first Sea Lord was Admiral von Battenberg, who would later change his name to Mountbatten. And of course, I'm sure you know who his son was, the famous commander of HMS Kelly, etc. But Battenberg pleaded with Patey to take the job, and he was extremely reluctant. In the end, Battenberg actually told Patey that this was the wish not only of the Admiralty, but of the King, and that the King would be extremely pleased if Patey would do this. So with this, shall we say, encouragement, he took up the position. And maybe as part of that, he became the first Royal Navy officer to be knighted by the King aboard his flagship since 1581, and that the person before him had been Sir Francis Drake. So again, maybe that was some form of encouragement. Okay, he was actually a quite excellent officer and a good trainer. And many times, whether it's military history or naval history, you will find that the units that fight the best and the commanders who do an excellent job are those who can train their men. Okay, he was also a pretty skilled strategist and tactician, but just like his ship, he would also be unlucky and miss a chance that perhaps would have made him quite famous, and HMAS Australia perhaps a different kind of ship than it became. Okay, at the end, he was given command of the America station and moved sideways for someone else when Australia joined the Grand Fleet. So when war came in 1914, the first thing that the Australian Fleet Unit had to do was to take over and invade German possessions in the South Pacific, in the Solomons, at Samoa and New Guinea, etc. And this shows you, unfortunately, sorry, it's a bit blurred, but the original map that was drawn up to show the operation. So what did HMAS Australia have to do at the beginning of World War I? Okay, first of all, to escort the troop transports, to support the landings. Now, to support landings in World War II, of course, meant to throw, quite a few salvos of heavy artillery onto the beaches so your troops can land. But in World War I, this was totally unnecessary. The German garrisons were very small, and no doubt upon seeing a flotilla of Australian and indeed I think also sometimes Japanese vessels, because the Japanese were our allies at the time, training their guns on the island, and you're like probably maybe a company of men and mostly native troops who probably disappear pretty quickly into the bush. You will surrender very quickly, and this is pretty much what happened. There was very little action involved in occupying these areas. The troops themselves, as you can see here on the right, were actually Royal Australian Navy reservists, because at this stage, the army was totally committed to being sent to Egypt, where they would eventually then be sent to Gallipoli, etc. So we didn't have a Marine Corps or a Marine force such as the Royal Navy and later the Americans would have. So the reservists would do. And as I said, it was a pretty easy job. And they're the areas, Rabaul, Papua, and German Samoa, that they occupied. Okay, but there was a bigger threat, von Spee. So he had been harbored in China at Tsingtao, and he decided that he wasn't going to hang around until the Royal Navy came to him. So he sought permission and was given permission to break out from his base in China and to perhaps cause as much trouble as he could in the Pacific Ocean, and somehow, although it was probably very unlikely, get back to Germany. And of course, he was able to do that. His ships formed a pretty small but quite powerful unit, 2 armored cruisers and I think about 6 or 7 light cruisers. And the 2 major ships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the armored cruisers, were actually the gunnery champions of the German fleet, sorry. Okay, so we all know, of course, that SMS Emden was released to operate in the Indian Ocean. The captain of the Emden had begged von Spee for the chance to do this. And von Spee at first reluctant, but later on realized that this would be a very useful decoy. And indeed it did prove. And Emden was fairly successful, of course, until it caught up or was caught up with HMAS Sydney. So von Spee entered the South Pacific, and he then headed towards the South American coast and to the south of the South American coast, where he met a British squadron under Admiral Christopher Craddock at the Battle of Coronel. Craddock was an extremely brave man. He was not perhaps the greatest tactician. He certainly was not in the same league as von Spee, but he was a real fighting admiral. And although his two ships, the major ships in his squadron, Good Hope and Monmouth, were crewed with reservists, were totally obsolete, were unable to use the guns in the lower portions of the ship because of heavy seas, he decided to engage von Spee. And of course, the Germans were able to dispatch Craddock's ships very quickly without really any damage to themselves. And there's a long story about this, and there is a lot of blame, perhaps, with people like Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty, not the first Sea Lord, who they had a lot of mixed up orders. He told Craddock, you know, he should wait because they had an old pre-Dreadnought battleship, HMS Canopus. Anyway, it's a long story, but let's just say that poor old Craddock, in the best traditions of the Royal Navy, went down fighting. Okay, so von Spee himself was a very honourable gentleman, and it's interesting to note that his two sons were with him. They were junior officers, one aboard Gneisenau, I think, and one aboard Scharnhorst. Okay, and then into the Atlantic with an encounter at the Falklands with HMS Invincible and Inflexible, which then obviously was the end for von Spee's squadron. In fact, when they stopped off in, I think it was Montevideo, for coaling in South America, the local German community came out in droves, and they had a ceremonial dinner where he was presented with flowers, and he thanked the lady. He says, "Thank you very much, madam. These will do for my grave," because he knew already, had an idea that he was not going to escape the British. And so von Spee, his sons, and 1,900 German sailors were killed, and 6 German ships sunk. And of course, HMS Invincible and Inflexible, they had done the job that they had been designed to do. That is to hunt down raiders, enemy ships in distant areas, to quickly intercept them and to bring them to battle and to destroy them. Unfortunately, it took nearly a whole day to do. The British battlecruisers depleted nearly their whole supply of armor-piercing and heavy explosive shells. And after that, British gunnery was put under the microscope of how can we make this better, because obviously if we can't sink 2 armored cruisers with 2 battle cruisers in quicker than like 5 hours or whatever it took them, 6 hours, then something is wrong here. And they were actually hit many times by von Spee's ships. As I said before, they were the gunnery champions of the German fleet, but because they were at such a great distance, the belt armor of the battle cruisers was able to keep out the heavier shells of the German cruisers. Okay, so before that happened, and I'm sort of gone ahead of myself, HMAS Australia was hunting for von Spee's ships. And you see at the bottom there a beautiful pair of photographs of Australia and Scharnhorst. Of course, they never came into contact with each other, but it would have been very interesting to see if that would have happened. And Patey actually predicted von Spee's plan. He correctly thought that he's heading for the southern coast of South America to round the tip, and he wanted to go there with HMAS Australia. He also had some Japanese heavy units attached. but he was told, no, search here, in other words, in the area of Central America first, and also you need to turn around and detach some of your cruisers, etc., etc. Anyway, all this was a waste of time, and HMAS Australia came up with nothing, except when they actually rounded into the Atlantic, HMAS Australia was able to capture von Speye's supply ship, the Eleanor Vorman. Now, this is the beginning of unhappiness on HMAS Australia, because it appears that some of the old salts, who were probably Royal Navy guys aboard HMAS Australia, were rubbing their hands together and saying, look, lads, we captured this ship. It's full of supplies. You know what that means, don't you? And of course, a lot of the young Australian guys didn't know what that meant at all. He said, you fools, it means we're going to get prize money. And so suddenly some of the Australian crew obviously saw, well, I won't say dollar signs because they didn't have dollars, but pound sterling signs in front of their eyes. And Patey disillusioned them pretty strongly, very quickly. And his idea was, when he heard about this, was, well, that's ridiculous. We don't have time for that. We can't spare anyone for a prize crew. In other words, a bunch of our guys to go over there and take over the ship. So it was sunk. And a lot of people were not happy about that, because they had thought that they might be getting a nice, tidy sum of money out of that. But of course, it didn't happen. Okay, and here's the second part of that map that I showed you earlier. It's a little bit better when it comes to resolution. And you can see the area in which the ships were between Mexico and South America there, whereas von Spee was much further to the south. And of course, they were not able to find them and engage them. So eventually, HMAS Australia would join the Grand Fleet. It became the flagship of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron, because HMAS Australia was actually, first of all, the newest ship. It was in the best condition. And Patey, as the admiral in charge, was senior, and therefore he took over command of the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. But they had already missed 2 of the major engagements of the war, the Battle of Heligoland and the Battle of the Dogger Bank, where the battle cruisers had covered themselves in glory. The commander of the battlecruiser fleet, Admiral Beatty, was in the old fighting mode of turning the blind eye to any danger and going for the neck. And at Heligoland and Dogger Bank, he had been rewarded by inflicting damage on the Germans, specifically light cruisers, and he sunk the large German armored cruiser, Blucher, at the Dogger Bank, although he probably could have done better if his subordinates had followed his orders. So when they arrived, HMAS Australia was definitely the Johnny-come-lately and had missed a lot of the fun already. Okay, the other ships in the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron were New Zealand and the name ship of the class, Indefatigable. And they quickly started to become used to the routines of the Grand Fleet, such as endless patrols in the North Sea, looking for the Germans, who were usually safely and snugly in port, while the British were suffering the cold and indignities of being wet through 24 hours in the North Sea. Okay, not long after this, Patey was replaced by Rear Admiral Pakenham, probably because Pakenham was someone who was on very good terms with Beatty. And I think Beatty also was, how can we say, a little bit leery of having Patey, who was, I think, perhaps even, how can you say, he had longer service than Beatty, and was probably superior to him in rank, actually. I'm not 100% sure on that. But anyway, poor old Paddy was packed off to the American station. And of course, this endless routine of patrolling with no sign of the Germans made the crew morale suffer. Now, it's the same thing that happened to the Australian soldiers in the army, in the AIF, when they went off to Egypt. They got into a lot of trouble. They were very unhappy because the Australian character craved action. That's what they had joined up for. That's what they had volunteered for. And they were just whiling their way in Egypt, in the flesh pots, doing nothing. And it's a very similar thing that happened to the sailors in HMAS Australia. They had joined up, many of them, for action, to serve their country, and all they were getting was a lot of bad weather and the North Sea night after day after night after day, and no sign of the Germans. Another thing that exacerbated this was there was some rivalry with HMS New Zealand. Okay, now we all know to this day that in the fields of sport, whether it's cricket or football or any other endeavour, when it comes to Australia and New Zealand, there is a rivalry. And in those days, it was the same. And even though there was only probably not even a fifth or sixth of the crew actual New Zealanders, there were mostly British sailors, there were enough there to make life hard for Australian sailors when they were in port. So when they were docked in Scapa Flow and Australian sailors perhaps would meet some New Zealanders, the New Zealanders would be letting the Australians know in no uncertain terms, where were you, Aussie, when we were at Heligoland? Where were you, Aussie, when we were at the Dogger Bank? In other words, you know, we're it and you're nothing. And actually, that probably had some truth to it, because relatively soon, HMS New Zealand was seen as one of the crack ships of the Grand Fleet. And another thing that the Australians were very unhappy about was that, you know, up in Scapa Flow or Cromarty Firth, depending on, or the Firth of Forth, wherever they were based, shore leave was limited anyway, even when they were in port. And what are you going to do when you're in Scapa Flow? There's nothing to do except walk around the hills and look at large expanses of water, which is beautiful. But, you know, the lads were looking after some pubs and some female company and, you know, the usual thing, I guess, that sailors look for. And they didn't find it. And what they got instead was endless patrols and no sign of the Germans. Okay, a little bit here about the man who commanded the battlecruisers. Okay, so Sir David Beattie, it's a good photo of him, a dashing, debonair, gung-ho, let's go get him type officer. He was distinguished already during the Sudan campaign, and he came to the notice of Churchill very quickly because Churchill was a junior officer and correspondent for London newspapers during the Sudan campaign. And of course, we all know that Churchill liked to drink, and Beattie didn't mind a drink either. And they got to know each other. And then one day, Churchill was on the riverbank as Beattie's flotilla of gunboats was being hauled by thousands of natives up the river. And he says, I say, Churchill, you look a bit thirsty there, old boy. And Churchill says, I'm always thirsty. He says, well, come aboard. I have some champagne on ice. And don't ask me how he got the ice, but he had on ice champagne. And they sat there as their gunboat was being hauled up the river, sipping on champagne. And Churchill never forgot that. And also, I mean, obviously, to have the patronage of someone like that is pretty good. But also, Jackie Fisher saw in Beattie the exact opposite in some ways what he saw in Jellicoe, who would become the leader of, or the commander-in-chief of the Grand Fleet, whereas Jellicoe, of course, was a quiet, thoughtful man who was painstaking over details. Beatty was the opposite. As I said before, he was aggressive. He wanted to get at the enemy. And in some ways, this impetuous behavior could be seen as reckless. And we know this perhaps, at the Battle of Jutland, his signalling was almost non-existent to Jellicoe. And he believed that the battlecruisers should be a battle force, not just for scouting, in the thick of it. And he was at odds with Jellicoe due to this. But in the public eyes, he could do no wrong. He was a dashing hero. Mind you, the public didn't know that in his private life, his married life was a bit of a sham, and that he was being cuckolded by his wife on numerous occasions, although Beatty never let on about this, or he probably knew about it. But anyway, I guess that's gossip. But again, that shows you something of his character. And his shortcomings, I said before, poor signals when they were scouting at Jutland. He was unable in the thick of battle, for whatever reason, to supply Jellicoe with the exact coordinates of the German fleet. So in the end, Jellicoe kind of had to guess how to deploy the Grand Fleet. And of course, we know that he deployed it pretty well, and in a large arc to starboard was able to cross the T of the German fleet. No thanks to Beatty. And then Beatty, of course, the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon after Jutland, was kicked upstairs, and Beatty took control. And here we have a great shot of HMAS Australia in the North Sea after the Battle of, just around the time of the Battle of Jutland, leading the 2nd Battlecruiser Squadron. And you can see the kind of conditions. And always a challenge to be in that environment, because that looks actually pretty, apart from the smoke and fog, etc., it looks pretty calm, but it wasn't always like that. And then actually, here we have the bad luck for HMAS Australia. So, poor old HMAS Australia has never been in battle. Now a chance is coming up, or would come up, but again, HMAS Australia would miss out. So on patrol, one of the countless patrols off the Horns Reef in the North Sea, in heavy fog and almost no visibility, they were following an anti-submarine zigzag course, and Australia was actually in the middle position of the line ahead, and it collided with the stern of HMS New Zealand. The damage to New Zealand was fairly slight, but the damage to HMS Australia's bow needed to be repaired. This was actually seen by the fleet as, you know what, those Aussies crashed into the back of New Zealand. Although it was supposed to be nobody's fault, but the blame was put on Australia. But in Dockyard, it was being repaired, and they were absent at Plymouth. And HMS New Zealand, of course, was present at Jutland, and it survived the sinking of 3 other battle cruisers, including Indefatigable, and distinguished itself. Okay, one of the reasons why the German battlecruiser Döflinger and Sedlitz was so heavily damaged was because of the shooting of New Zealand, which was excellent, landing many hits on those 2 German battlecruisers. And an interesting sidelight is that when New Zealand was finished, one of the ornaments that the New Zealand people gave to HMS New Zealand was a full dress Maori chieftain's outfit with long feathered kilt and chest piece and headgear that a Maori chief would wear in battle and for ceremony. And the Maori chief and elder who gave this to the captain of HMS New Zealand said, "If you wear this in battle, no harm will come to the ship and you will be victorious every time you fight." And so whether through superstition or whether because of respect to New Zealand, the captain of HMS New Zealand always wore the Maori chieftain's outfit in battle. You can imagine what kind of incongruous sight this must have been on the bridge of HMS New Zealand. But it's indisputable that in the line at Jutland, ships in front of and astern of New Zealand were blown out of the water, whereas New Zealand barely suffered any scratches and also was, as I said, quite successful in its fighting. And of course, the result of all of this, more disappointment, more bitterness for the Australian crew. They missed out again. Another blow to morale. Okay, so before we look at this section, so I think we're seeing a pattern here that through no fault of their own, through bad luck and through other circumstances beyond their control, the crew of HMAS Australia are missing out on what they volunteered for, to fight, to share the dangers of their other compatriots in the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy, to be part of the war effort. And so therefore, morale was going down. Okay, so here we have a wonderful photo at the beginning of 1918, a photo of the ship's complement of 800 officers and men, and some photos depicting, first of all, a portrait of an able seaman aboard HMAS Australia, next to one of the 4-inch guns. Shows there the uniform that is worn, and to the right, something a little bit undress, shall we say, as the fellows are washing their clothes, one of the many chores that had to be done aboard HMAS Australia. In these days, the men had to wash their own clothes. There was no, as there were in later times, usually Chinese guys to actually wash the clothes for them. They had to do it themselves. Okay, so here we have a great photo, and thanks to the person from the Historical Society that shared this with me, I've included it in the presentation. A photo of the ship's medical staff. Okay, the ship was able to look after both medical and dental problems, and this was definitely something that had happened again because of Admiral Fisher's reforms to the Navy. Back in the old days, you may have had a ship surgeon, but he probably was not a qualified doctor. This had all changed by the 20th century. And we see here on the left, I think, the stern of the ship, where the men are cleaning off snow and ice from one of their patrols in the North Sea. And maybe they had a little bit of fun when the officers weren't looking, chucking a few snowballs at each other. And we see here the battle honours of HMAS Australia on this sort of scroll. Unfortunately, compared to Dogger Bank, Heligoland and Jutland, these battle honours such as Samoa, German New Guinea and Rabaul were pretty small beer. Okay, to the right, we have a great photo of the Aussies on one of the few shore leaves that they were able to take. And when I showed this to some of the Naval Historical Society guys the other day as a test, I was told that this fellow here on the extreme left, who has his fingers to his nose, I was asked, why do you think he has his fingers to his nose? And of course I answered, well, I don't know, maybe something stinks around there. And I was then told that the possibility is that there's an officer present, because apparently the guys call the officers pigs. Please correct me if I'm wrong, or that's some sort of mistake. But anyway, that's a possibility, I guess. But there's no denying how happy these guys are to get off the ship and hopefully have a good time. But these opportunities were very rare. And as I said before, poor morale and a feeling that they were being treated unfairly. Now, one of the few situations in which Australian sailors would be able to distinguish themselves in battle came in April 1918 with a large-scale raid on, okay, and the proper way to pronounce this is Zeebrugge, okay, but a lot of people pronounce it as Zeebrugge, so I'll just pronounce it as Zeebrugge because that's what most people say. Okay, so the amphibious raid that was mounted, a kind of first generation special forces kind of raid on the Zeebrugge Canal. Okay, if we have a look here, this is the entrance to the canal, and German U-boats would be able to use the canal to actually exit into the open sea. It was heavily guarded by this concrete mole, and the idea was to take a couple of obsolete British ships, including the old protected cruiser HMS Vindictive, to crash them into the mole and then disgorge a large group of volunteers to attack the German gun positions and machine guns that were guarding the mole and guarding the approaches. And then a number of block ships would then sail into the area to be sunk and block the canal. Okay, so this is one of the mad, almost impossible schemes that only the British could come up with. And of course, they would do this later on in World War II at Saint-Nazaire, and even you might say Dieppe was another one of these situations, large-scale raids. But the Australians were part of this, some of them, and if we see here, so over 200 sailors aboard HMAS Australia volunteered, but only a few were chosen. Okay, an engineer artificer, 5 sailors and 5 stokers took part. So these 5 sailors were actually in the armed assault. If we look to the left, we can see a painting here that depicts the kind of action involved as the men storm onto the mole from HMS Vindictive. And to the right, a photograph showing the block ships that actually were scuttled. Now, some of the sailors that won a DSM, we would see them later in a different light, unfortunately. So at the end of the war, HMAS Australia was given the honour to lead one of the long line of British dreadnoughts and battlecruisers at the surrender of the German fleet. And the ship was retained for a while in the Grand Fleet, and of course the sailors were kind of like, yeah, I know, but the war is over, we want to go home. And then eventually they were on the way home. If you look at the photo on the right, you can see the sign with the sentiment: the lonely sailors are wishing to correspond with nice little widows with nice little pubs. And you can see there the sentiment. Of course, we want to get home and we want to find some nice young ladies, and I'll let you use your own imaginations. Okay, so they got home after 4 years. The volunteers aboard HMAS Australia thought, well, you know what? The war is over, and why the hell are we being now treated with even more harsh discipline than when the war was on? They couldn't understand it. So again, they were pretty unhappy. And there was a lack of leave during the war years, as we know, and then a resentment about pay and enlistment conditions, and then a perception of favoured treatment of the British personnel who were aboard their ship as opposed to the Australians. There was a perception. Anyway, a long voyage home, but no leave. They were not allowed off the ship. Finally, they arrived at Fremantle and they were given a couple of days. The people of Fremantle were like ecstatic to see these guys. They gave them a wonderful welcome. They took them into their homes. The sailors were home at last and they were loving it, and they wanted to stay an extra day or two. So they made up a committee. They went to the officers. They said, we want to stay another day. And of course, the officers were not happy about this. And one of the people who was a leader of this mutiny, which it actually was a mutiny, was Dalmorton Rudd, DSM. So he was one of the guys who had distinguished himself on the attack at the Mole to win the Distinguished Service Medal. Okay, a brave man in action, but a rebel. So the dissenters, the mutineers, were calmed down by Captain Cumberledge. And then, just as they were about to leave, the stokers down below went on strike and wouldn't fire up the boilers, delaying the ship's departure. So petty officers went below and they finally got the ship underway. So this was not going to be forgotten about. So Dalmorton and his brother Leonard were arrested, and 3 other seamen as well. They were seen to be the ringleaders. It was a mutiny as far as the Navy was concerned. There was a court-martial aboard HMAS Encounter in June 1919. So these 2 young guys and the other ones realised that, okay, I think we definitely screwed up here. They pleaded guilty and with regret. But the court was unmoved and they were imprisoned for 2 years, hard labour. The story in the media broke, and, you know, the war is over, and most Australians were happy that the war was over and were happy to see their sons and their brothers and husbands, and suddenly these 2 guys are going to jail? What, over just because they couldn't understand the sentiments, they couldn't understand the Navy idea of what a mutiny is? And so the public raised a big outcry. And the politicians, who of course get voted in by the public, also tried to intervene, including, of all people, Billy Hughes, the so-called Little Digger, who was the Prime Minister. But the Navy Board refused to rescind the sentences. They were unmoved. So Hughes went above their head, and he requested the British Admiralty now to rescind the sentences. And then finally, the Admiralty acquiesced and the men were released from Goulburn Prison. And of course, Dalmorton, to the right here, was able to marry his sweetheart, which is probably one of the reasons given in the media why these guys should not be sent to jail. And of course, that would have tugged on a lot of heartstrings. Okay, and at the end, HMAS Australia was a flagship again for a royal visit in 1920. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, visited. And not long after that, there was the Washington Naval Conference that I mentioned before. People were worried that there was going to be another armaments race, including another arms race, this time between the Americans, the British, and the Japanese. They were already making plans to build super dreadnoughts with 18-inch guns, with displacements up to 65, even 70,000 tons. These kind of ships, if they had been built, would have almost bankrupted, especially England, which was at the end of World War I, almost broke. And somebody got the bright idea, you know what, guys? If this happens, not only could it be the start of another war eventually, but we're going to be out of cash. So the Washington Naval Conference was convened, and it did actually in the end become one of the reasons for the war in the Pacific, because the Japanese were relegated a smaller amount of ships in those ships that were allowed to be built. The ratio was America 10, Britain 10, and Japan 8. The reasoning being that, well, you know, America and England, they have to fight in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the Japanese only have to fight in the Pacific. But it wasn't seen like that in Japan. Anyway, the upshot of all of that was that many ships in the British fleet had to be scrapped because, you know, it's disarmament. And the older ships, as far as the British were concerned, were the ones obviously to be scrapped. And HMAS Australia, even though it actually belonged to us and we had paid for it, as far as the British were concerned, well, you know, the Australians paid for it. Yes, I know it belongs to them, but really it belongs to us. And so therefore, we shall destroy it and we shall sink it, and the Australians will have to get rid of it. This caused a major public outcry of our flagship. And there were many suggestions to save the ship. One of the suggestions was to keep it as a monument, as a museum ship. And, you know, I'm a volunteer with the Maritime Museum, and I guide people aboard HMAS Vampire and stuff. And in my mind, I wonder if they had actually saved it, you know, probably not through another world war and the 1950s, etc. But if it still existed today, like many of the American battleships, even USS Texas, etc., still exist, what a wonderful thing it would be. But anyway, that was not to be. The government cited, well, you know, it's too old, it's obsolete, we don't have enough ammunition for it, we're going to have to get rid of it. And as you see there, the transition between a beautiful ship dressed for a royal visit and only 4 years later, a rusting derelict ready for scrapping or scuppering, I should say. Okay, one of the suggestions, and I'm coming towards the end here, one of the suggestions was to rebuild Australia. Okay, now, in Japan, after World War I, ships of the Congo class battlecruisers and the Ais, Hyuga, and Mutsu were all being rebuilt and modernized into the 1920s and 30s. So a lot of people in Australia said, well, why are we trying to get rid of this ship? We paid for it. Why don't we actually modernize it and we can build it along similar lines to HMS Tiger? And they actually came up with a design that you can see here to do that. The turrets would be put on the center line, just like HMS Tiger. There would be extra armor and oil-fired boilers instead of coal, small tube type boilers, new turbines, and an increased speed of 29 knots. Of course, unfortunately, this was pie in the sky and it would never happen. But it's one of the what ifs. What if it had existed in 1941? Who knows? And of course, we have the end where it was scuttled with ceremonial honors and much sorrow. And as it sunk, it heeled over and went down deck first. And it was found in oceanographic multi-beam imaging of the bottom, out past Sydney Heads, lying upside down on the seafloor. Okay, and that's a bibliography of some of the stuff I used. And thank you and questions.
So thanks for everyone for coming. David and I put this program together. So I found that absolutely really interesting. A lot of things there I didn't know. And thank you, Kez, for bringing it all to life in such a good way.
Yeah, my pleasure. Actually, I just wanted to bring this up. one of the in the question section, somebody called Peter Poland wrote, "My father was in New Zealand at the time of the collision, and I can tell you what he wrote about it." So I'll try and pursue that. That sounds really interesting. Something I would love to add to the presentation.
We'll give you Peter's contact details.
That'd be great. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. That was very enjoyable for me as well.
Okay. Well, thanks, Kez. Thank you all for participating and listening. I'll just end the presentation now. Thank you.
Okay, see ya.
Bye now.